Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American origins and evolution of institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this program. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to another edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I'm Bill O'Brien, and once again, I share with you the fact that it is a distinct pleasure and an honor on my part to be with you once again for this second day in our week, in this final week in September. And I welcome you to today's program. I invite you to participate actively in the conversation and discussion. I mean that, and I promise you that your input, your suggestions, your comments, your criticism, your additions, whatever you would like to contribute to the Virtual Center will be appreciated not only by me but also by others who are tuned in listening to this program, either live or who will pick it up in a on a pre-recorded basis. They will pick up the archives, or they are recording it on their MP3s or on their iPods or whatever. I talk about that, and I don't really know how all of that works necessarily. But I know that because of the change in time zones and various other things, I've heard from a number of people who find it impossible to listen to us when we are live, and they are listening to the broadcast at a later date. And, I know that they would appreciate the comments and suggestions that those who are listening in real time, so to speak, would make to the conversation, as well as suggesting future conversations or future directions that we might go here at the Virtual Center. The phone number, which will get you directly into the studios and will get you directly on the air as a result of that, our phone number is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. My personal email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906, all one word, I-E-N for O'Brien, 906@gmail.com. It is a pleasure to be with you. I've said that, and I say it again because I mean it. I genuinely mean it. And I look forward to the day, and I mean that sincerely, when here at the Virtual Center we will engage in a bit less monologue and a little bit more dialogue and a little bit more discussion. And I know that a lot of that is contingent on getting and embracing relevant information to our listeners, to our audience. And that's been my focus since we first began our 3-time-a-week programming here at the Virtual Center. My goal has been to try to present the kind of content and what I hope to be the kind of meaningful perspective that will give people a sense of background, which will enable them not only to understand and appreciate the context within which certain pieces of primary information, be they letters, documents, articles, speeches, or whatever. An awful lot of the meaning to those primary sources comes from the political context, comes from an appreciation of the understanding and the background and some of the issues that informed the day, so to speak, so that we could maybe nail down a little bit more precision in trying to assign meaning, and especially when you're reading between the lines and you're inferring things as possible meaning or hypothesis. You're basically throwing out or suggesting a hypothesis, a way of interpreting the information or the facts that you're looking at. All you're doing, obviously, is speculating. These are educated guesses. But the more we know about the period and the more solid our command of of the particular context is, the more likely that our educated guesses will be on target. I might alert you today that I think we're going to be doing some of that. In putting together some material today with the idea as to where we might go and what we might do during our 2 hours together today, I stopped at a certain point. And the reason I did that is because I was into the area of speculation. And while I think it is extremely interesting to speculate and to engage in the exercise of what oftentimes is referred to as what-if history, where we begin to take a particular body of information and interpret it one way with the idea or the caveat and say, or suggest basically, what if we looked at the following information from this perspective? What would that mean? What would be the outcome? What would be the implications of that? And then looking at it from a totally different perspective. And I found myself in preparation for today at the point where I was beginning to engage in speculative hypothesis, in what-if history. And I stopped as far as preparation because I didn't want to sketch out and lay out all the potential directions that we might go in. Very honestly, I'd like the information and the material itself to take me there. I don't want the material to take me to a place where I've already been. And what I mean is, I didn't want my preparation to be such that it raised the kinds of questions and took us to the places that I think we might go today. I would rather go there and be a novice, as many of those who are listening to the program will be novices. I mean, these, when you play the game of what-if history, you're speculating. And chances are most of the people that are privy to it, that are tuned in, have never been there before. And so the theory is, or my thinking is, that as we play what-if history, some of the scenarios and some of the possibilities being thrown out there will be news, will be first-time experiences for people who are listening in. And they, in turn, raise their own questions. But if you visited there before, it's not as likely to raise the kinds of questions. So my thinking is, when we do visit there for the first time, I want it to be my first time as well. And so my preparation only went so far today. Now that could become a problem, that could be dangerous. But I would suggest to you that over the years, that's kind of the way I like to prepare. And what I mean is, I like to basically think about as we go on the air, this is where I'd like to go, and these are the issues that I'd like to address. But how we address them and what issues we raise and what kinds of questions the content itself is going to raise for us, I don't prepare that. It seems to me that I want it to be fresh and I want it to be new for me as well as for you. And that way we can all together speculate and reflect and begin to play what-if history together. If you play anything other than what-if history, then you find yourself in the position of telling people how to interpret the past. And I'm very uncomfortable with that. I know how I interpret it, and I don't mind sharing the way I interpret it. I interpret a particular period or a particular piece of information or body of information. I don't have any problem at all sharing my interpretation with other people. I don't have a problem telling other people why I think that interpretation has validity. But if you're playing anything other than what-if history, you are sending a message. You are implying, even if you don't say it, that what you are sharing is factual. When you engage in what-if history, you're being honest up front and saying, all I'm basically doing here is playing with the information I have. And these are some of the conclusions I see as possibilities. Let's play with them. Let's take this one and run with it and see where it takes us. Let's take that particular interpretation as far as it'll take us and see where that takes us and what what questions it raises for us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And when you complete that exercise, when you're through playing What If History, you don't necessarily have answers, but you surely have an awful lot of possibilities, a lot more possibilities than you had going in. I think that's healthy. I think that's a healthy exercise, because what it does is leave unanswered a series of questions that have been raised by the game of What If History. And you have left more conclusive answers for another day. And you have given all of those people that participated in the exercise with you an opportunity to go off on their own and follow through on some of these things and find some of the answers for themselves. I think that is a very, very valuable experience, and to be very honest with you, that's what I hope we can accomplish here at the Virtual Center, is to throw out a series of what-ifs and possibilities rather than engage in the kind of sure-thing history that most of us have been exposed to from the time we were in grade school. I sat in grade school through school like everybody else did, and I basically confronted the same kinds of conclusions that I'm sure you did as well. And one of those that I remember so very, very well is the concept of the idea that, it seems like all the questions have already been answered. There's nothing left to answer. Everything that the book is telling me, or everything that the teacher is telling me, has an answer. So what do I do? And basically my job then is to basically embrace answers to important questions that other people have reached, but never having the opportunity myself to approach those questions and answer them for myself. And I think the result of that is we've turned an awful lot of people off, and the result is we've graduated an awful lot of fairly ignorant people when it comes to their understanding of the past and their understanding of the history of their own nation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those are some of the issues and some of the things that we're trying to confront here at the Virtual Center, and I hope that we can do that. Before we get into that in any meaningful way today, I wanted to go back and touch base a little bit with the issues we addressed yesterday. And if you remember, the principal issue that we addressed, I think, is the idea of social stratification. The idea of what we're hearing today more and more being termed a two-tier society, a society of the few and the many. The terms that have been thrown around since the recession of 2007 are the so-called 1% and the 99%. In fact, there was a whole movement a couple of years ago in the country that referred to themselves as the 99%ers. And what that basically means is we're the people that are not getting rich during the recession. We're the people who are suffering as a result of the recession. And, of course, the most telling and significant part of this was that the breakdown between the 99%ers and the 1%ers is so gargantuan. And what that basically speaks to is the fact that a very, very few people proportionally are deriving all the benefits of the recovery. As slow and as tedious as the recovery has been. Some people, relatively speaking, have done and continue to do quite well as a result of the recovery. But the vast majority of people do not, and have not found that the recovery is helping them at all. I came across an article. I printed this a number of days ago. The date on the article is September 7th, so I've been sitting on this article for more than 2 weeks, almost 3 weeks. And the title of the article is The Great Stagnation of American Education. It appeared in the New York Times under the series of articles that they refer to in the Times as the Opinionator articles, a gathering of opinion from around the web. And this particular article was written by Robert Gordon, It's on the stagnation of American education. And I can share with you that Robert Gordon is a professor of the social sciences at Northwestern University, and he is currently writing a book on the American standard of living since the Civil War. So he's for all practical purposes, a student of the last, of American history, if you will, of America since the end of the Civil War, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in America. And some of the data, when I read the article, I made a note to myself at the top. And this is what I wrote to myself. And I did this several days ago. The message I wrote myself is a virtual litany of reasons for stagnation. A good survey of problems, no solutions, though. And so basically what this article is kind of a menu, if you will, of some of the issues and some of the breakdowns in American education. And, of course, he makes it very clear that what's happening in American education and what's happened to the American economy are kind of in sync. They go hand in hand. They always have. I didn't necessarily intend, and when we went on the air today, to address this article. I thought I would kind of put it aside and hold it for another day. But here we are in reviewing yesterday about the issue of social stratification and the difference between the haves and the have-not, the few and the many, the 1% and the 99%ers in American society, the extent to which we as a nation, as a society, must deal with the realities of social stratification, because I believe very firmly that the degree of inequality in our society in terms of income and wealth is literally jeopardizing the well-being of our republic. A lot of people say this. A lot of people buy into it. Not that many people go into the details and the reasons why. I think that's what we're doing here at the Virtual Center. When we talk about the structure of the American political system and the way the founders intended for it to work, the way they defined and wanted the republic that they created to work, it's clear that there are certain assumptions and certain priorities and certain have-to-haves in order for this to be effective. And one of the realities is that social stratification, which is always a problem in any society, addressing it is always a priority. But what we are seeing in our society is that not only are we not addressing the society, but we are addressing the problem of social stratification, but we are engaging in activities which are making it worse. And that's what we talked about yesterday when, if you remember, we talked about the re-release by Disney of the new Littlest Mermaids movie and making it available for interactive viewing and listening only to those who own their own iPods. Great deal for Apple, a great deal for Disney, and a great deal for those youngsters who had access to and are comfortable with using iPods. But for the rest of the society, they are left out of this entire experience. Not being able to engage actively on an interactive basis in a showing of The Littlest Mermaid, to many people, would be nothing traumatic. Big deal, they would say. I'm not at all suggesting that not being able to participate interactively in the latest technological re-release of The Littlest Mermaid is going to inflict serious damage on our culture or on our society. I'm not at all saying that. What I am saying, however, is that this is just one more example of the extent to which some of our major corporations and major institutions, those who are the only ones that can do something positive about the realities of social stratification in our society, are engaged in policies and programs and day-to-day activities which are not designed to close the gap between the haves and the have-nots, or between the 1% and the 99%, but rather to exacerbate that gap, to make it wider and make it more pronounced. And that's scary. Because what it suggests is that too many of the people can fix the problem are organizing their activities in such a way that they are focused on profiting from the realities of the situation rather than addressing the dangers of it. And if we continue in this direction and social stratification becomes worse and worse, we're going to lose the vast majority of our people. They literally are going to throw up their hands and surrender and give up and say, the idea of equality of opportunity in America is a myth and nothing more than that. There's no sense even trying. The best thing to do is find a place where I can be secure and I can be safe and I can make sure that I don't go under, and just hang on for dear life and not participate in this game anymore. And I would suggest to you, when a lot of the people in your society reach those kinds of conclusions, your society is in trouble, its future is in trouble, and anything resembling a functioning republic becomes merely a myth and something that maybe used to be, but no longer is. That's what we were talking about yesterday. And what we did after the Littlest Mermaid story, if you recall, is go back and look at the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening. It's focusing specifically on the way Enlightenment thinkers looked at religion in America and comparing and contrasting it with the way that the revivalists or the evangelicals involved in the Great Awakening in the early 18th century looked at religion, the way that they defined and understood God. And the realities are, and this was the conclusion that we reached at the end of yesterday's program, is there's absolutely no question that the way people understand, define, appreciate, and know God becomes a function of their income level, becomes a function of where they are in society. Those who are so-called well-heeled, those whose children get the best education, those whose children get the kind of cultural upbringing that seems to be preparing them for positions of leadership and influence in society, those that John Adams referred to more than once as the natural aristocracy, come to know God and come to understand God in a way which fits their role, their position, their future, their assumptions about the world and about the society that they are about to enter if they are just getting out of school, if they are just, ending their education and beginning their professional careers. By definition, the Enlightenment definition of God, the idea that God does not perform miracles, does not interfere in people's day-to-day lives, does not help batters in the last of the ninth inning hit home runs, does not allow football teams to throw 75 and 80-yard Hail Mary touchdown passes at the end of a game in order to pull it out at the end. The assumption that God created the universe but does not actively participate in it, but rather created man and gave man the abilities and the skills and the potential to do wonderful things with the world at man's disposal, with the world that God put at man's disposal. It's very obvious that the people who define God that way, who see God that way, who think about it and reflect upon it and basically understand God as only that way because it seems to make the most sense. It seems to fit their worldview. It seems to fit the way they live their lives. It seems to fit the future as they understand it and have been prepared for it. And the assumption is it's extremely intellectual, and it is an interpretation that is strengthened and fed by analysis and interpretation of Scripture. Consequently, the sermons, the messages from religious leaders to the flock, to the congregation, tend to be extremely analytical and extremely intellectual. They require thought, they require reason, they require reflection, and they require understanding. By definition, that means that they are only going to appeal to a certain level, to a certain group of people. On the other hand, what about the rest of the people? Those that we define today as the masses. Well, in colonial America, before the American Revolution, these were the people that were, many of them were coming from Europe, who were basically resettling into the New World. They were coming here for opportunity. The opportunity was the availability of land in the West. And so they were coming here, and if they could possibly do it, unless they were indentured to somebody and obligated to work off the expenses of their trip over here, no sooner did they land than they moved west, because that's where the opportunities were. So America was a growing mobile society. People were moving, and they were moving into the West. And in the process, they were experiencing the possibilities and the potential of a life, of a way of life that did not exist in the world that they came from, in the old world, but only in this new one. But in the process, they were distancing themselves from organized religion, because the traditional organized denominations of religion, the Congregationalists of New England, the Episcopalians or the Anglican Church in the Virginia and the South, the Catholic Church, the Presbyterian Church, the traditional congregations that were associated with the initial settling of the 13 colonies along the coast. Religion was place-bound. And the idea was that religion and the Word of God was there, but it was required that the people come to it on a regular basis in order to receive their religious education, their religious teaching. It's kind of like today, in today's world of higher education. We have these traditional institutions that are fighting like crazy against the idea of online instruction and the use of the internet for the delivery of courses off campus at odd hours, at weekend courses and everything else. Some of the more prestigious traditional institutions resist these changes like crazy, because they are based on the idea that the only quality education can happen on-site, on the campus, and somehow students must find a way to come to the education. But when you find alternative delivery systems to deliver the education off campus to somebody else, by definition, it becomes watered down and much less effective and much lower in its quality. And so therefore, institutions resist like crazy the move in higher education today to move into or to incorporate some of the latest technology into the delivery of instruction, because they feel like it's going to demean the quality of the educational product. And so they can't change. They resist change. And the institutions that are doing that well, are doing well today, are the ones who are willing to embrace change rather than resist it. The same kinds of things happened in religion, and the result is that those Protestant denominations able to take advantage of the realities of colonial America were the ones who could come up with ways to deliver the Word of God to the people rather than expect the people to come to them because they weren't coming. And so we have the tremendous explosion in the number of Baptists, Methodists, and those evangelical branches of Protestantism that were evangelical in their nature, and the idea being that they were bringing the Word of God to the people rather than requiring that the people come to them. And what we have historically is referred to as the Great Awakening. And a lot of people talk about, one of the terms that's often used to explain this is the distinction between what some people refer to as old lights and new lights. The traditional denominations who insisted on delivering the Word of God in the traditional way, and then those that were into the more contemporary realities of society and were delivering instruction, if you will, in the Word of God to the people, to the frontier, in the form of circuit riders and tent revivals and all the rest of it. Most history books make that distinction. And most history books go out of their way to make the point that the Great Awakening was one of the most significant movements in American history. Because when it was over, the result was that if America was not diversified, was a diverse society in terms of religious diversification before the Great Awakening, it sure was after. The result was that at the end of the Great Awakening, there were so many different denominations that in terms of religion, America had become a pluralist society. It was heterogeneous rather than homogeneous. And what that meant was there was no way for government to govern when government insisted on including religion in the governance package. The only way that you could govern a pluralistic society was to preach religious toleration and ultimately separation of church and state. You had to take religion off the table when it came to government and making laws and establishing a tax system. Because if you didn't, then you were creating nothing but discord in society rather than harmony. And the whole idea of government is to seek harmony and seek to find ways to address and eliminate discord. And if you emphasize religion, you were creating discord. So in a sense, the way that the colony of Pennsylvania was originally settled under the charter of William Penn, where William Penn offered land and opportunities and citizenship to anybody who believed in the Redeemer, who was a Christian, who came to Pennsylvania. It didn't matter what religion you were. So the result was that Pennsylvania was settled by Dutch Reformed and Mennonites and Scotch-Irish and Jews, a variety of different religious groups who were drawn to Pennsylvania by the promise of religious freedom. And there's no question that later on in American history, the entire nation is forced to adopt the Pennsylvania model of separation of church and state, because that's the only thing that will work in a pluralistic society. The point is that government needs community, needs to create a sense of unity, needs to address and find ways to bring diversity under control and to reduce it and find commonalities in order to create a society which is much more homogeneous. The way to do that is to basically promote the idea that we are all equal under the law, we are all subject to the rule of law, we are all treated equally before government and before the law, and that whatever religion we might be, which is obviously a variety, is not a factor in how you will be treated, how you will be taxed, or anything else. That becomes the only solution. My point is, and this is the point that we made in yesterday's program, my point is that in order for government to govern effectively, it must seek to address and close the gaps which divide people and find ways to bring them together, find ways to build a sense of community, and dodge or downplay or directly address and repair the elements of diversity and discord which make government more and more difficult. What I'm suggesting is that even though from the very beginning America was a socially stratified society, divided into the few and the many, the wealthy and the not so wealthy, the fact of the matter is government, in order to govern effectively, had to find a way to appeal to everybody and to convince everybody that they were all important and that they all had something to contribute, and that ultimately the success of the whole was contingent on the willingness of everybody involved in the community to participate actively in it. And therefore everybody had a sense of worth. Everybody had something to contribute. That's the way you build community, and that's what government had to do in order to govern effectively. It's not that social stratification didn't work. It's the fact that throughout our history, government's number one priority was to address it and find ways to downplay it or to close it or to redirect attention away from it or something. But never to govern in a way which exacerbated it, which made it worse, which made it more visible, which made it more obvious that some people are more important than other people. You can't do that and expect to be able to govern effectively. That's what makes today's America so very unique. This is the first time in American history that America has not apologized for the realities in our society associated with social stratification. We brag about them. Not only that, but the implication is that we're sending the message to our own people that the opportunities for everybody to be on the other end of the spectrum were there. And if they're not there, it's because they were deficient. In other words, if people are poor, if people are struggling, it's their own fault. It's something lacking in them, whether it's in their character, in their skills, in their ability, in their intelligence, or whatever. But the implication that people are trying to sell is that everybody has an equal opportunity to be successful. And the fact that only a few are is because the few deserve it. And those who aren't wealthy are not wealthy, and they deserve to not be wealthy. And so rather than address the issues of social stratification, we tend to be governing in order to make them more visible and more real. And the result is, if we don't do something about it, if we don't turn around, we are going to destroy our republic, because we are going to destroy people's incentive to even participate any longer in this society. Because there's fewer and fewer opportunities available to more and more people. Literally, what we're talking about here is that so much of the income and so much of the wealth is coming into the hands of and under the control of the very few people, the very few, that we are asking the rest of our population, which is growing proportionally quite rapidly, as the middle class, as what we call the middle class in American society is disappearing, is being pushed down. What we have is a situation where more and more people are effectively competing for the crumbs that are left. And you cannot sustain a society that way. That is an incredibly long, and I apologize for it, introduction to this article by Robert Gordon on the great stagnation of American education, which was in the New York Times on September 7th of this year. Listen to some of this data, and that's the reason I think it fits very well into this. For most of American history, Gordon says, parents could expect that their children would, on average, be much better educated than they were. That's no longer true. This development, Gordon says, has serious consequences for the economy. Here's some data. The epical achievements of American economic growth have gone hand in hand with rising educational attainment, as the economists Claudia Goldin and Lawrence Katz have shown. Here's some numbers. Excuse me a moment. From 1891 until 2007, real economic output per person grew at an average rate of 2% per year, enough to double every 35 years. Let's wrap our arms around that number, wrap our heads around that number. From 1891, from almost the beginning of the 20th century until 2007, for the last 110 years approximately, real economic output per person grew at an average rate of 2% a year, which was enough to double every 35 years. The average American was twice as well off in 2007 as he was in 1972, 4 times as well off as he was in 1937, and 8 times as well off as he was in 1902. So in other words, as time went on, the economy was generating and dispersing the kind of wealth throughout society which made it possible for the average American to become twice as well off in 2007 as they were in 1972, which is, again, 30, what is that, 38, 40 years, 45 years. 4 times as well off as 1937, 8 times as well off as he was in 1902. And then Gordon says that it's no coincidence that for 8 decades, from 1890 to 1970, educational attainment grew steadily. But since 1990, that improvement has slowed to a crawl. Companies pay better educated people higher wages because they're more productive. The premium that employers pay to a college graduate compared with that to a high school graduate has soared since 1970 because of the higher demand for technical and communication skills at the top of the scale and a collapse in demand for unskilled and semi-skilled workers at the bottom. There's less and less opportunity for the unskilled, more and more opportunities being generated in the economy for the well-skilled or the highly skilled. However, as the current recovery continues at a snail's pace, and President Obama talks all the time about how slowly the recovery is happening, concerns about America's future growth potential are warranted, Gordon says. Growth in annual average economic output per capita has slowed from the century-long average of 2% to 1.3% over the past 25 years, to a mere 0.7% over the last 10 years, over the last decade. As of this summer, 2013, per-person output was still lower than it was in late 2007. The gains in income since 2007-2009 Great Recession have flowed overwhelmingly to those at the top, has been widely noted. Real median income was lower last year than it was in 1998. What we are saying is that income and wealth is being distributed so disproportionately in the last, since the recession, that those at the top those at the top are getting most of the results, and those who are not at the top are actually losing ground. Median family income was lower in 2012 than it was in 1998. And there are a number of causes for this, and he goes through a number of these things, like the retirement of the baby boomers and the withdrawal of working-age people from the labor force and the rise in inequality in income distribution and all the rest of it. And then he talks about education and talks about the extent to which education is also declining. These numbers are unbelievable. The surge in high school graduation rates from less than 10% of youth in 1900 to 80%. This is unbelievable in 1970. In 1900, less than 10% of American youngsters graduated from high school. By 1970, that 10% had increased to 80%. And what Gordon is pointing out, is that this was a major driver in economic growth in America. The astounding growth in per capita output and productivity in America was tied to the extent to which high school graduation rates were increasing rapidly and steadily throughout the 20th century. But we obviously have peaked. The percentage of 18-year-olds receiving high school diplomas fell to 74% in the year 2000, according to the University of Chicago economist James Heckman. He found that holders of GEDs performed no better economically than high school dropouts. Most of the people who got GEDs were high school dropouts. And that the rising share of young people who are in prison rather than in school plays a small but important role in the drop in graduation rates. Then there's the poor quality of our schools. And he goes and talks about how the extent of our schools has deteriorated apace with the decline in economic output. I'm not going to go any further in that. I just wanted to make the case that the numbers are speaking to, the data is speaking to the reality of what we're talking about here. And it is very significant. That's kind of a rehash, if you will, of what we did yesterday and where we came yesterday. And I wanted to go over that because I think it's very important. This morning, as I've mentioned numerous times here at the Virtual Center, I teach a class on Tuesdays to senior citizens, and I've been doing it for better than 20 years. And as I've mentioned many times, over that 20-year period, I have become a senior citizen. But this morning, my seniors were in my class. We were talking about this stuff and talking about the idea of stratification. And of course, these people all remembered the original release of The Littlest Mermaid. And we were talking about the technology and talking about the realities of social stratification. And here in southern West Virginia, we were talking about the lack of accessibility to broadband and the inability of so many of our young people to access the internet and to do the kind of work at home, even if they have access to the internet in their schools, which they do. When schools get out in the middle of the afternoon, they are denied access to the internet. They can't do their homework. Teachers, by definition, cannot assign homework that requires access to the internet because so many of their students don't have it. And so the reality is that the entire educational experience is developing in a different direction than it's going for those people that are able to buy iPhones and the newest version of iPhones, et cetera, et cetera. An article in this morning's local paper made the point that Apple reported that this month, when it came out with its newest version of the iPod, of the iPod telephone, Apple sold 9 million phones in 3 days. 9 million phones in 3 days. And, of course, the reality is the vast majority of the people who bought these new phones during that 3-day period are people that owned the former version of iPhones before that, iPods before that. So the fact of the matter is that Apple is directing its research, its resources, and its talent to marketing technology to those who have the money to afford the technology. Nobody is addressing the vast numbers of people who don't have access to the technology to begin with because there's no profit there. And we are a capitalist society. We are profit-driven. The private sector can't afford to make broadband available to rural areas because there aren't enough people there to make it pay off, to allow it to pay off. Much more profit to be made in coming out with new advances and new technology to those people that already have the technology. And so what's happening is our whole productive establishment is focusing on the haves because it can't afford to focus on the have-nots. And the result is that the gap between those two groups is becoming wider and wider and wider, and it's having an impact in what happens in our classrooms and what's happening in our workplaces and the ability of American industry and the American worker to compete with foreign workers and on and on and on and on. And, of course, we've spent a lot of time here at the Virtual Center. I spent a lot of time over the last many, many years in teaching, looking at and assessing the pros and cons and the in and outs of America's political system, the so-called the two-party system, the way American politics works, the way American elections work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, of course, one of the realities of all of this is that as the gap between the two groups becomes wider and wider, and as the size of the two groups changes proportionally, as the number at the top end shrinks, the number at the bottom end expands. It makes perfect sense. So also does the ability of one group to participate intelligently in our political system as opposed to the ability of the other group. The reality is that the founders recognized, despite the fact that the Declaration of Independence said that all men were created equal, the founders knew that everybody wasn't created equal. And they knew that in setting up a republic, you had to find a way to guarantee that those with the appropriate resources and the appropriate access to education, knowledge, and understanding were the ones who made the most meaningful input into the political system. Decisions had to be made by the people who were most qualified to make them. And the basic assumption was that the vast majority of people were not qualified to make intelligent decisions. But they were citizens in a republic. Therefore, they had a right to participate in society. So the question is, how can they participate intelligently when they are not privy to the kinds of insights and the kinds of information that they need to participate intelligently in decision-making? And what develops is the sense of dependency of the many on the few. The idea that the few go into the business of telling the many what they need to do, what they need to support, what they need to be careful of, what they need to worry about, the people that they need to not listen to, etc., etc., etc. And so, in other words, it is a society that is built upon a foundation of dependency. The working poor being dependent on those whose skills and ability and wisdom and educational level and income level make them much more capable to make decisions and participate intelligently in decision making. One of the things that you find if you read the papers and the letters of the founders is that they realized that in order to be educated as a well-read citizen, in order to know the issues and know the rights and wrongs and the goods and bads of politics, it took time. Education takes time. But the reality is that the vast majority of Americans were struggling day to day to make it. They worked, and they worked when they stopped working for an income, they started to work around the house. The vast majority of people just had to struggle just to make it. They didn't have time to become educated in the issues of the day, in world affairs. They didn't have the leisure that a good education requires. And they talked about this. So in setting up the political system, you had to make sure that you set it up in such a way that the right people called the shots. Those that Adams referred to as the natural aristocracy. The people with the cultural upbringing and the cosmopolitan worldview and the level of education that equipped them to make intelligent decisions when it came to taxes and policy and foreign policy and political decisions and international decisions and all the rest of it. The vast majority of people didn't have the time and didn't have the luxury to become schooled in what they needed to know to be an intelligent, educated citizen. They had to take their cues, their signals, from the few who did, from those who had leisure. Into this situation came the South, because the South actively argued that that was the benefit of slavery. That everybody knew throughout the history of the world that the best societies were the ones who had slavery. Because the more the menial labor is performed by slaves, the more free time, the more leisure the upper classes have to read and think and experience the kind of education that equips them to make quality decisions. So the South argued that the Southern culture, Southern society, was actually superior to Northern society because slavery made available the kind of leisure that people, that the educated, really needed in order to be educated and make intelligent decisions. So Southerners began to argue that the slave system was a positive good because it freed up and created leisure for the white decision-making class, if you will. I would suggest to you that that's what we're into today. And let me bring this hour to a close by mentioning the fact that this coming Monday, September 30th, the nation faces the prospects of a government shutdown. And the issue on the table is the Affordable Health Care Act, better known as Obamacare. And there are certain members, primarily of the Republican Party, Senator Cruz of Texas, Marco Rubio of Florida, and a number of others, who have made it their political mission to derail Obamacare before it goes into effect on October 1st by threatening a shutdown of the government on September 30th. And what they are threatening is the shutdown if the president doesn't pull Obamacare off the table. It is a game of political chicken, and the threat of a government shutdown is the end game. But even that's not the end game, because in October comes the prospects of defaulting on the nation's debt by refusing to increase the debt ceiling. And the president has made the point that if government shuts down on September 30th and then the nation defaults on its debts in October, the results on the economy will be devastating. Yet the game of chicken goes on. My point is that if you listen to what the people who are moving towards the shutdown are saying, it fits perfectly into the scenario that we've been painting here for the last hour. To wit, it is absolutely vital that we derail Obamacare before it goes into effect on October 1st. Because we know that Obamacare is bad for the nation. We know that Obamacare is going to explode the costs of health care. We know that Obamacare is going to explode the cost of government. We know that Obamacare is going to expand the size and the intrusive nature and the red tape associated with overregulation of our healthcare system. We know that the best healthcare system in the world is going to be sacrificed once Obamacare comes into effect. Therefore, it is absolutely vital that we kill it before it goes into effect, because once Obamacare begins to work, once Obamacare goes into effect, and people begin to see how good it is, we'll never be able to derail it. We'll never be able to kill it once it begins, because people are going to love it. Therefore, we have got to kill it before the people have a chance to embrace it. What in the name of God does that say? It says that we know what's best for the people of this nation better than they know themselves. We know that Obamacare is bad, and therefore we are justified in doing whatever we need to do to kill it. But in a republic, in a popular government, we can't allow Obamacare to go into effect, even though it is law of the land, because once it starts, people are going to realize how much they like it. And once that happens, we will no longer have the chance to kill it. The analogy for this in the period of the founders occurred in 1782 in New York, when the members of Washington's Continental Army, who hadn't been paid because Congress didn't have the power to tax and therefore didn't have the money to pay them, were threatening to mutiny and take over control of Congress by force of arms in order to get their pay. And the people that orchestrated this mutiny, including Alexander Hamilton, knew that the only way that they could strengthen the national government and not be left with the weak national government created under the Articles of Confederation was that they had to find a way to strengthen the central government before the peace treaty come ending the American Revolution. Once the peace treaty was signed, there's no way in the world that we could get the government to change and strengthen the central government. So the idea is the only chance we've got to strengthen the national government is that we must do it before the peace treaty is signed. So from their perspective, they had everything to gain by not ending the war, which produced American independence. Because as long as the peace treaty took, as long as the war dragged on, they had a chance to materially change the balance of power in the nation in favor of the upper classes. But once the peace treaty came, they knew that their chance was gone. Those who are threatening shutdown of the government right now know that the only way that they can kill Obamacare is to kill it before people understand what it means, because once they understand what it means, they'll want it. Wow. Unbelievable. We have gone beyond the top of our hour. It's 5 minutes after the hour. Let's pause and take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll visit for our second hour here at the Virtual Center. I'm Bill O'Brien. Thank you for staying with us through this first hour. I invite you to stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to today's edition of the Virtual Center. I'm Bill O'Brien, and it is a pleasure to be with you. If you have stayed with us from our first hour, we thank you for staying with us. And if you are just joining us, welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. And, of course, that and civic responsibility is a very important part of what we're about. We are not talking about the rights of citizens vis-a-vis government. We are talking about the responsibilities of citizens to government in order to create the kind of well-governed community that I would suggest to you that the founders definitely wanted to create and wanted us to have. It is a pleasure to be with you, and I welcome you. I invite you to participate actively in today's program by picking up the phone and giving us a call. Area code 304-658-3333 is the number. It'll get you into our studios, and we'll get you right on the air. That's 304-658-3333. If you'd like to communicate directly with me about today's program or about other issues that interest you, I would love to hear from you, and I promise that if I possibly can, I will respond to you in kind. If you take the time to write me a well-reasoned, thoughtful email, then I promise you that I will take the time to answer it appropriately, and basically respond to you in kind, and try to put the same thought and the same effort into my response that you put into the initial email. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. I apologize for taking a full hour in review of yesterday's program, but I really believe that this issue of social stratification, the divisions in our society which make it impossible for government to govern, is an issue that we've got to continually address and we've got to recognize. The reason it hasn't torn our society apart in the past is because government has never lost sight of it. And when it appeared that it would, and I heard, it was interesting, in an interview this week on Bill Moyers on public television on Sunday night, it was an interview with Robert Reich. And I heard Robert Reich use this expression, and it's an expression I had heard before, but I never heard it used in this context. And what he was talking about is that he's talking about the addressing the issues of inequality in today's society. His point is that we are not radicals in raising these issues. We're not out to destroy capitalism. In fact, he pointed out that he's a supporter of capitalism. And he said that's one of the things that we've got to realize, is that the issues in American history, the meaningful issues, have most often not been about an alternative to capitalism, because most people realize that capitalism, more than any other form of economic and political organization in the history of the world, has created the possibility of growing and distributing wealth in ways which was never possible before in previous forms of organization. But his point is that the very nature of capitalism, the fact that it is so driven by profit and self-interest, causes it periodically to threaten to run off the rails, so to speak. And in the past, it's been necessary to rein it in and get it back on track. This is Robert Reich's perspective, and I thought it was very interesting, and I'm doing the best to share it with you. And his point is that, for example, the progressive movement at the turn of the century and the New Deal movement in the 1930s were efforts to restore balance within the capitalist system in periods of American development when that balance had been thrown way out of whack. The 1890s during the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the of the multimillionaires and the plutocracy that existed in the late 19th century, and then of course the tremendous growth of private property and industrial power in the 1920s, which led to the depression, the crash of the market in 1929 and the depression into the 1930s. And his point is that the progressive movement at the beginning of the century and the New Deal movement of FDR in mid-century were corrective efforts by society to get capitalism back on track, so to speak. And of course, I thought it was a very interesting way to put it, but it kind of feeds into the approach that we took when I suggested that progressivism was not radicalism. Progressivism was a moderate form of conservatism, and that basically says the same thing. I think it's very important that we look at it, we address it, and we never lose sight of it. One of the things that I wanted to do in today's program, and in the introduction, I talk about the fact that we would engage in some what-if history today. I was referring specifically to the effort that we have undertaken to look at the issue and the evolution of rights and responsibilities in our society. We spent an inordinate amount of time a couple of weeks ago on the Massachusetts Body of Liberties of 1641, which has 98 items in it. We talked an awful lot. We went through the document in quite a bit of detail. And one of the things we looked at was the fact that because Massachusetts in the 17th century, in the 1600s, was a theocracy, was planned and driven by a mission based on the idea that religion and government were one, and that there was no distinction, no separation between religion and government. What that meant was that man-made laws, as closely as possible, were intended to mirror God's law. There was no distinction between the two. So when the architects of the Body of Liberties of 1641 put together on paper, laid out in writing, the rights of human beings, not of citizens, of human beings, you'll remember in the Massachusetts Body of Liberties that visitors, travelers, foreigners, servants, women, children, everybody had rights. And the reason is because everybody was a child of God. They did not believe that everybody was equal. They never made that point. In fact, if you study Massachusetts society in the 17th century, religion was the defining factor. Those that were church members were the only ones who could vote. And in order to be a church member, you had to be able to demonstrate to the satisfaction of the congregation that you had received special signs or that some unique, unexplained event or phenomenon had occurred in your life which could only be explained as an act of God. And if you can prove that God somehow intervened in your life that way, then the congregation would admit you to full membership as a member of the church, as one of the saved, so-called. And as Congregationalists, as Calvinists, these people believe that God had predestined certain people to be saved and certain people to burn forever and ever in hell. But they also believed that God functioned around a series of covenants. It was a theology or a religion that was clearly affected by the idea of reason, common sense, and logic. And so they believed that it made perfect sense that God would identify his saints, those that he had predestined to be saved. He would send signs. He would perform miracles. He would do certain things in order to identify his saints, his special people. And it was up to the people to make the case that they were one of those saints. And if they were effectively able to do that, they were admitted to full membership in the church. And full membership in the church was required before you could vote, before you could run for office. So it was a theocracy. And what makes that significant, and looking at the issue of individual rights and responsibilities in that society, was that there was no distinction between your rights as a citizen and your rights as a child of God. The assumption is that all of these were the same, and that everybody who lived was entitled to certain rights as a child of God. And if you'll remember, there were 57 specific issues, rights addressed in the Massachusetts Body of Liberties that applied to everybody. And then, after they had gone through 57 different items, then they began to divide them into specific categories. Those are the rights that everybody gets. Now, here are 15 rights that are appropriate and attributable only to voters, full citizens, full church members. And then there were the rights attributed specifically to women. And then the rights belonging specifically to children. And then the rights belonging to servants. And then the rights belonging to visitors and travelers, those who were not citizens but just traveling through. So by the time you get to the last one, 98, you have covered all the contingencies. The Massachusetts Body of Liberties is considered one of the most comprehensive documents ever put together in this country, because it speaks to an incredible array of rights and responsibilities, the relationship between human beings, between people and government in this society. And because there was no distinction between God's law and man's law, the result was, and I'm using a word here because intentionally, that meant that every right that a citizen had was an inalienable right, potentially. I'm using the word inalienable rights because that's what Jefferson used in the Declaration of Independence. What that effectively meant was that every right that was given to a citizen in this document, or recognized, acknowledged in this document as belonging to every citizen, was a right that initially came from God. Therefore, government, man, society, could not infringe upon these rights unless it followed certain procedures. And these procedures had to be well known. They had to be publicized so that every citizen knew what the rules were. Every citizen knew what was expected of him. Every citizen knew what his rights were. And therefore, if a citizen did indeed violate the law, he could and should fully expect to be punished. And that was the basic premise. That if there were limitations on these rights, if government could inflict certain limitations on these rights, it could only be done under certain circumstances. For example, the one that I'm thinking of is capital punishment. If banishment, dismemberment, or execution were the penalties on the table for a particular crime, this document required at least 2 witnesses that could testify beyond a reasonable doubt to the truth. If you were to be convicted of a crime which carried a penalty of death or dismemberment or banishment from the colony, then the law required that there be 2 witnesses to testify to the fact that you did it. And if you didn't have those 2 witnesses, then you could not find the person guilty. So there were tremendous lengths taken to guarantee the rights and the justice of the system, because this was not man's system of justice. This was God's system of justice being enacted by man. And the symmetry between man's law and God's law was expected to be perfect. I would suggest to you that when we get to the American Revolution, and when Thomas Jefferson begins to put pen to paper in the Declaration of Independence at the Second Continental Congress in June of 1776, and is able to construct a document which is presented to the full Congress on July 2nd, 1776, and after a number of changes are made in that document, it is approved as the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. Jefferson is making a distinction in his document in rights. Jefferson is specifically addressing the issue of what he calls inalienable rights that come from the Creator. And he is specifically identifying those rights. At the risk of losing audience, because I know that almost everyone who's tuned in today has heard this hundreds of times, I want to share with you the relevant paragraph from the Declaration of Independence that addresses and defines the mission and the philosophy upon which American independence is based. Jefferson begins the Declaration by saying, and these are my words, I'm not citing or reading Jefferson's words here, but what Jefferson effectively says in the first 5 lines of the Declaration, that whenever in human history it becomes necessary to sever the bonds that connect one group of people with another, and to return one group to the what he says are the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitled them. In other words, in the past, whenever it was necessary to take some drastic political action in order to restore order, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes. In other words, whenever people in the past have taken political action like this, it only makes sense that they are required to explain the reasons why they're doing this. And then Jefferson goes into the most, what we think philosophically is the most meaningful paragraph in the Declaration of Independence. And I want to deal with this. So if you'll permit me, and I know many of you can almost recite it. When I was in school, we had to memorize it. You probably did too. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their happiness, their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. Translation, this is serious stuff. You don't do this over the weekend because you're bored. Consequently, what history has shown, Jefferson said, is that people will put up with an awful lot before they reach this stage, before they're willing to take this kind of drastic action. But then he goes on and says, but when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. And then Jefferson lists 27 specific charges, most of them introduced with he has done this, he has done that, he has refused to assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He's forbidden governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance. He's refused to pass other laws. He has called together legislative bodies at unusual places that make it uncomfortable and impossible because it's so far away so that people can't get there. He's dissolved representative houses repeatedly. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states. In other words, he's prevented the influx of new immigrants into many of these states. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing to agree to laws establishing the judicial power. He's done this, he's done that. In other words, there are 27 specific charges leveled against the king. And then at the conclusion, Jefferson's argument is based on this, and he has a paragraph, and he says, you know, what have we done? We have sent olive branch petitioners. We have begged. We have prostrated ourselves. We have done everything to try to get the king to change his behavior and back off, and he's refused to do it. He's turned around and declared us to be in a state of rebellion. Therefore, there's nothing left for us to do but to take action in our own hands and recognize that the king, Great Britain, has violated the contract, the covenant. But we don't talk about covenants anymore. We're talking contracts now because the religious issues out of this. We are only doing what the history of man suggests that people have to do when they've tried everything else and nothing has worked. We have no option left except independence. So what he has done, he has very succinctly, and what I mean by that is in very tight language, Jefferson has laid out and referred to them as self-evident truths what people believe about the relations between government and people. and that people are entitled to certain rights and entitled to be treated certain ways. And then in the charges he makes against the king, he has made the case, Jefferson has made the case, that the king has done all of these different things to us, and we have tried desperately to avoid the last straw, which is taking the matter into our own hands and abolishing government. But now we have no choice left. In a sense, what Jefferson has done in the Declaration of Independence is justify before the people and before the world the right of the colonies to be independent from Great Britain. He has made a logical, tight case which is so brilliantly put together that it is the mother country that is responsible for this, not the colonies. The contract between mother country and colonies has been violated, but not by the colonies, by the king. We are the conservatives here. All we're doing is what we have to do in order to preserve our rights as citizens, as British subjects. If the British Constitution has been broken, it wasn't us that broke it, it was the king, it was Parliament that broke it. What Jefferson has done is make the case for independence in such a way that Great Britain becomes the villain and the colonies become the good guys, the innocent victims, who are only doing what they had to do, and they have waited as long as they possibly could wait to do it. This is the strategy that Jefferson adopts in the Declaration of Independence. It is not a document to define citizen rights. It is not a Bill of Rights. It is a political document designed to justify the rights of the colonies to be independent from England. The mission here is to make the case for independence. It is not to lay out a structure of government which defines and identifies the rights of citizens. The reason that I'm saying this is because there are substantial numbers of people today who insist that the Declaration of Independence is much more than a political document, that it is indeed a statement of self-evident truths about what man's rights are and what the limitations on government must be. In a sense, the emphasis is put on that one paragraph at the expense of the rest of the document. And that one paragraph that begins, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," becomes the philosophical justification for the American Republic. It becomes the philosophical justification for the rights of citizens vis-a-vis their government. And it becomes the justification for limiting and minimizing the size of government based on the assumption that the more active government is, the fewer the rights citizens have. It creates a situation which pits citizen and government against each other, suggesting that the rights of one are sacrificed when the powers of the other are expanded or enhanced. It is focused principally on the idea that citizens have rights but not responsibilities. It is based on the assumption that the freedom of citizens is directly proportional to the limitations on the ability of government to govern. That is very important because it's obvious which people, or which, philosophically, which groups of people would be most inclined to interpret the Declaration of Independence this way. The Declaration of Independence is an incredibly important document. It's one of the major documents in the history of this nation. It's one of the major documents in the history of the world. There's absolutely no question that the positions and the rights claimed by the American colonies in the American War for Independence reverberate throughout the Western world. There's no question that the French Revolution in 1789 is based on the same principles. There's no question that the revolutions which sweep Europe in the early 19th century are driven by the American Revolution. There's absolutely no question that the wars for independence between the former colonies of Spain and Portugal in the New World, Brazil and Ecuador and Argentina and Colombia and all of the nations of South and Central America that fight for their independence do so and justify their actions for independence on the American Declaration of Independence. There's absolutely no question then, and this is Gordon Wood's point in his Radicalism in the American Revolution, his Pulitzer Prize winning book. There's absolutely no question then that while many people choose to look at the American Revolution as a conservative revolution because it didn't seem to have the violence associated with the French Revolution, officials weren't being guillotined, weren't being executed in the numbers that they were in France in the early 1790s. Because our revolution seemed to be a more sensible, humane revolution than some of these other nations of the world, there is a basic argument that the American Revolution was basically conservative, that it was not radical at all. But what Gordon Wood makes, the point Gordon Wood makes in his book, Radicalism of the American Revolution, and the point that I want to emphasize, is when you look at the impact of the American Revolution on the rest of the world, the rights claimed by the American colonies in the Declaration of Independence becomes the statement of rights that many of these nations use to justify their own independence from colonial powers and to justify the kinds of revolution that happens within their own country. When you look at the degree of change that the American Revolution caused to happen throughout the world, and the extent to which peoples throughout the world have continuously placed the justification for their rights as human beings, as citizens, on the shoulders of Thomas Jefferson and on the Declaration of Independence that he wrote, you have to conclude that the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence are conservative documents in one sense, but are clearly radical actions when viewed in a broader sense. A few pieces of information, a few facts about the Declaration of Independence and about the drafting of it that I think are very significant and important to know. This is the stuff that is not in the textbooks. This is the stuff that most of our students who study the American Revolution in school and in our textbooks never confront, never experience. If you look at the debates of the Continental Congress, if you look at the reception that Jefferson's Declaration of Independence gets in the Continental Congress, the first thing you have to notice is Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration of Independence as opposed to the final document as approved by the Continental Congress. Specifically, if you were to lay Jefferson's first draft out and then look at the final product, you would recognize, you would find that Congress made a total of 86 specific changes in Jefferson's original draft. Let me repeat that. Congress makes 87 specific changes in Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration of Independence. It takes days to go through this document. And one thing after the other, Jefferson's language is falling. And John Adams tells us that Jefferson is becoming more and more disheartened as the debate and the discussion goes on. When the Declaration of Independence was finally passed, Jefferson believed and wrote in letters to his friends that his document was a failure because Congress had made so many changes in it before they were willing to pass it. And of course, we know that the document continues to live. And it's considered one of the most important and significant documents in the history of the world. Jefferson thought it was a complete failure because Congress made so many changes in it. Some of them were philosophical. Some of them were stylistic and grammatical. But most of them were political and very explosive. One of the major changes from Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration is an extensive paragraph that Jefferson included in his original draft on the slave trade. Jefferson recognized the hypocrisy of the Declaration of Independence in the face of a nation that supported and condoned slavery. Jefferson has been called throughout history since this time a hypocrite because slavery seemed to contradict the entire philosophy of the Declaration that he wrote. It is important to know that Jefferson himself saw the contradiction. And Jefferson had a lengthy paragraph in his first draft which was oriented towards the conclusion that in order not to be viewed as hypocrites by the rest of the world, the American colonies, as part of the Declaration of Independence, would have to abandon the slave trade, would have to abandon the dependency on this trade in human flesh. Jefferson is forced by the Southern delegates, led principally by Rutledge, John Rutledge of South Carolina, to remove that paragraph, to remove all mention of slavery from the Declaration of Independence. The word slavery never appears in the Declaration. There is reference to other kinds of people and stuff, but there's no mention of slavery. It's clear that the South is threatening to walk out of the Continental Congress if Jefferson's language on the slave trade remains in the document. That's the major change, but there are 86 other changes. And again, some of them minor, some of them stylistic, some of them grammatical. many of them political. And the fact of the matter is, what the Continental Congress has to do is find a way to get rid of the language and get rid of the content in the document which makes it impossible for the delegates assembled to come together and agree and be willing to sign a final document. And what they had to do is make change after change after change in order to get there. I think that's significant to know. It's significant to know for another reason. It's understandable that Jefferson would believe that the document, that his efforts were a failure because there were so many changes. But this is important to know. If you read the debates in the Continental Congress over Jefferson's draft of the Declaration of Independence, there is almost no discussion at all on the "we hold these truths to be self-evident" paragraph. When Jefferson says that these are self-evident truths, apparently he knew what he was talking about, because Congress spent almost no time at all discussing the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence. What he said, people accepted and believed. The bulk of the time in Congress, the bulk of the debate, focused on the specific charges against the king, on the content in Jefferson's declaration, not on the philosophy on which it was grounded, on which it was created. That is very significant. Because what it says to us is that the founders had no question or no qualms at all about the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence. Most of their attention was on the specifics of the charges against the king related to standing armies and quartering troops and taxing without representation and all this other stuff, all the things that they charged the king for. In our society today, the bulk of our discussion and the bulk of our debate about the Declaration of Independence focuses on the "we hold these truths to be self-evident" paragraph. For most Americans today, the 27 charges leveled against the King of England don't even exist. To most Americans today, the Declaration of Independence exclusively is only that paragraph. What that means is the part of the Declaration of Independence that received no attention by the founders is the part of the Declaration that receives all of our attention. Apologize for taking a moment to clear my throat, but it's very, very relevant to me that we spend almost all of our time and all of our attention on that portion of the Declaration of Independence that received no time and no attention from the founders, from the framers. And yet we spend almost no time and give no attention to that portion of the Declaration of Independence which received all of their time and all of their attention. I think that's extremely relevant, because it suggests that what we are about is cherry-picking the Declaration in order to make it say and make it stand for what we want it to say and what we believe it ought to stand for in today's world. We are not about trying to accurately follow the intent and the will of the founders. We are more about using the work of the founders to justify our own political philosophies, our own political druthers in today's world. Conservatives, led by the Supreme Court, by Justice Scalia and others, I'm thinking of former Judge Robert Bork, who was denied a seat on the Supreme Court, if you remember, in the 90s. Are committed to the idea that the entire philosophy of the American political experience is contained in the Declaration. And Justice Scalia makes the case in what he calls originalism that the only way that we can accurately interpret the meaning of the founders is to find a way to go back and recreate the real intent of the founders. I would suggest to you that if we did that with the Declaration of Independence, he's talking about the Constitution, of course. But if we did that with the Declaration of Independence, we would be forced to conclude that the particular interpretation of the mission and the philosophy of the Declaration that we want to believe the founders gave us was not, in effect, the position that they took at all. If we were to actually follow the intent and the will of the founders in drafting the Declaration of Independence, we would not be debating the paragraph that they didn't debate at all. We would be looking at the portion of the Declaration that they spent most of their time on. But we choose not to do that, because we're very comfortable with what the philosophy of that particular paragraph says. But the reason we're comfortable with it is because we want that paragraph to say that Jefferson and the Congress that approved this document were laying out the philosophical foundation for the American nation for generations to come. And what the members of the Continental Congress saw in 1776 is that Jefferson was using that paragraph not to lay out the philosophical foundations of man's rights forever and ever and ever. Jefferson was making the case for independence from the mother country. He was basically sketching out the philosophical foundation which justified opposition to the mother country and ultimately independence. That was the context in which he drafted the Declaration of Independence. That was the context in which Congress debated it. That was the Congress. That was the perspective that Congress approved with changes when they finally adopted the Declaration of Independence. So what we have here, an example of the extent to which we are using the founders, trying to use the founders to justify a political perspective, which is historically invalid and inaccurate and, to be honest with you, dishonest. What I want to do tomorrow here at the Virtual Center is look at the Virginia Bill of Rights passed less than a month before Jefferson wrote the Declaration, and look specifically at the rights that George Mason and the Virginia legislature believed a republic ought to be about, and compare it with the Declaration of Independence. And it is at that point that we will begin to speculate and play the game of what-if history. But it is 59 minutes after the hour, and Bob Kincaid is about to fire up for the start of his program this evening. So let me thank you for being with us today, invite you to come back tomorrow, and ask you to be safe this evening and have a wonderful evening. And thank you for tuning in to today's session of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and civic responsibility. I'm Bill O'Brien. Thank you.